Hello, children of God. This is a video lecture for Notes 2, Does God Exist? It's a big question, and we're going to try to tackle it today. We might not be able to answer it. This is something that's been asked about for as long as there's been civilization, but we're going to try to at least take a stab at it. So the first thing you're going to need is notes number 2, and as we go through, there's going to be several reflection questions that I'm going to ask you to pause and stop and answer those, and then there's also going to be places where you can just kind of fill in the notes on the slides, and then there's going to be, as we go through, you'll notice I'll leave you lots of room in the margins because that's where I want to see what else you're thinking, other things that I say that you think you might want to write down. So those are 3 things that I'm looking for: the reflection questions, the notes from the slides, and then some other things that aren't specifically in the slides to show that you're being an active note taker. So once you got that, we're ready to go. So let's go ahead and get started. Does God exist? Well, first of all, I want to ask the question, can we prove that God exists? And I want to know what you have to say about this. So pause the video and take a few minutes to write your thought. Can we prove that God exists? Yes or no? All right, so go do that. And once you're done with that, I want to say that we can't really prove that God exists, at least, I don't think so. We can't prove it in a 2 + 2 = 4 sort of way, in that sort of strict logical sense. But that doesn't mean that we can't know that God exists. There's a difference between being able to prove something and being able to know something. For example, can you prove that your parents love you? You probably can't. You could come up with alternate explanations for why they treat you the way they do. You could say, oh, well, they have to feed me because, otherwise they'd get in trouble. Or they have to drive me to school. They have to get me those things. Otherwise, I'd drive them nuts. There's other explanations that all those things, the way they treat you and the things they do to show that they love you, don't necessarily prove beyond the shadow of a doubt, absolutely, that they love you. But you still know that your parents love you, right? And I would say that God, at least from the Christian point of view, is much more like a person than he is just like some abstract mathematical concepts. And so, yes, we can know that God exists and that he loves us, even if we can't necessarily prove it like we can prove 2 + 2 = 4. So I would say proving that God exists or knowing that God exists is much more like being in love than it is like solving a math problem. Or much more like being loved by your parents. Those are some examples that I can think of. So that doesn't mean that people haven't tried to logically prove that God exists. So let's take a look at some of those. So does God exist? No. Sorry, it doesn't. I'm just kidding. Let's find out. All right, so the first one, you can, this is in your textbook, your Catholic Faith Handbook for Youth. If you flip to page 58, you will find that it has in the margins a list of proofs for the existence of God right there, and we're going to go through some of them. So if this is something that really interests you, you can turn to page 58 in your textbook and you'll find it right there. So the first one, we're going to kind of summarize some of them. The first one we're going to use is called the cosmological proof, or sometimes it's called the proof from causality. Now, if you look at the word, the cosmos, it has to do with outer space and that sort of thing. So that we're going to talk a little bit about the planets and from outer space. It talks about how things are caused, what caused this, what caused that. So I want, first of all, to show you this picture. It's a pool table. I drew it. I know, I'm an amazing artist. But yes, that's a pool table. Now I want you to imagine a pool table and that it has balls on the pool table, and you hit one ball with the pool cue and it knocks into another ball. It causes another ball to be hit, another ball to be hit, and so forth. Okay? Now, did this ball move on its own? No, it got hit by this ball. No, and that one didn't move on its own either. It got hit by that ball. And this ball didn't move on its own either. Somebody had to be playing pool, because pool balls are not the sort of things that move on their own. Okay? What this proof says is that basically the universe is kind of like this pool table. When we look around the universe, we don't see things that could make themselves, that could cause themselves to be, okay? Like, you ask me, how did I get here? I'd say, well, from my parents. And well, how'd your parents get here? Well, they came from their parents, and they came from their parents, and they came from their parents, going all the way back to, the earliest ancestors of humanity. At some point, when you keep asking what happened before, there had to be a first thing somewhere. You just can't go back into infinity. At some point, there had to be a first thing that caused everything else, a first cause, but that thing needed to not be caused by anything else. There needed to be something that moved everything else that didn't need to be moved, an unmoved mover, or a cause that was uncaused itself. An uncaused cause, an unmoved mover, a first mover. These are all phrases that we've used to describe whatever that first thing is that sets everything else in motion. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about God. And someone says, well, who created God? Well, if God was created, he wouldn't be God. Whatever created him would be. And so whatever the first thing is that wasn't moved by anything else, that could move without having been moved itself first by something else, whatever that first thing is, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about God. And so think of this as kind of the divine pool player. If you walked into a room with a pool table and the balls were all moving around all over the place, what would you think? You would think, well, something is moving those balls, because I know that pool balls are not the sort of thing that move on their own. You need somebody to be moving them remotely or magnetically, or somebody just hit it, before I walked in the room or something like that. And when we look around the universe, we see the same thing. We see all sorts of things that couldn't have caused themselves. They needed something else to cause them. And at some point, there needed to be a first cause. So this is what this proof says. This proof says that there must be a first cause to the universe, an unmoved mover that started it all off. And if you look on page 58 in your textbook, number 1 and number 2 on that page are basically different versions of, or different phrasings of this proof from causality, this cosmological proof. The next proof I want to go to is also on page 58, and also in a reading we're going to do in a few days. I want you to imagine a donut, a wonderful gooey donut. And let's say we're sitting in class and I come around and I give you this wonderful donut, and I give this wonderful donut. All right, sorry, I had to pause for a second. Somebody was at the door. But I'm back and we're talking about, does God exist? So imagine I give you a donut and I give everyone else in the class a wonderful, delicious donut. Everyone has their own donut except little Timmy. I don't give little Timmy a donut just because. What would you think about that? What would you think? You would probably think, well, maybe he doesn't like little Timmy, but in some case you would think that that's not really fair, right? That's not really fair that I gave everybody else a donut, but I didn't give Tiny Tim a donut. Now, here's the thing. If you did that same experiment with any group of people in the world, if you take any group of people in the world, as long as those people generally consider themselves equals, they would all have that same reaction, that it's not fair, that there's something wrong about that. Now, why is it that people from across times and across cultures more or less have the same ideas about what's right and wrong? If you go into, ancient civilizations, they're all going to have some basic laws about things. They're all going to have laws about violence and who you can hurt and who you can't hurt and who you can kill, who you can't kill, and when you can and when you can't, and go into war. There's always going to be laws about violence. There's always going to be laws about property, what you can take and what you can't take, who gets what and how much of it do they get. There's always going to be laws about sex and marriage and who you can be with and who you can't, and those sorts of things. And they tend to there's some disagreement, but they tend to more or less line up. There's far more agreement than there is disagreement. And you can look in religions across the world and the ideas of treat one another as you would like to be treated. All of those, many of those same things that we value in Christianity are found in other religions as well. So how is it that people from various different cultures at thousands of years apart all come to more or less a very similar understanding of what's fair and unfair, what's right and what's wrong? This is what we call the moral proof. It's basically saying that there's some higher power. That's higher than just some level of instinct. Because sometimes, we sense that our consciences or whatever it is inside us, it tells us that following our instincts would be wrong, to abandon a friend who is in danger, even though our instincts might be saying, like, get out of here, you're going to die. And that might be the more powerful instinct rather than the instinct to help a friend. But yet there's something inside us that tells us we should follow the weaker instinct and not the stronger instinct. So there's some higher power within us that goes beyond just instinct. It makes us think in terms of not just what I feel like doing, but what I should do despite of how I feel. Okay, and that's that sense that we find in all of humanity with some exception here or there, just like you might find someone who's blind, or you might find someone who, is colorblind or tone deaf or something like that. We find people who don't have certain abilities that the rest of us have. But without those few exceptions, we find the broad swath of humanity, most humans, the large majority of humans, have this pretty similar sense of what's right and what's wrong, what's fair and what's unfair. This higher power within us had to come from somewhere, this order to the universe. So the moral proof asks, where do our ideas of right and wrong come from? Where do our ideas of fair and unfair come from? They had to come from some higher power that tells us to follow this instinct and not that instinct, to follow this idea and not that idea. This is number 4 in your textbook on page 58. So there are other logical proofs for the existence of God. Those two are, I think, probably the strongest, and those are the two that I want you to know and be able to articulate. All right, so moving on, this is a common question that people ask. They say, why doesn't God just use miracles to prove he exists? If God exists and he loves us and he wants us to know him, then why doesn't he just pop down here and be like, hey, I'm God, how you doing? Here's a magic unicorn that, farts Skittles that you can have. Why doesn't he do that? So I want you to answer that question before we get into some thoughts on that. So pause right now and answer that question. Why don't you think that God doesn't just use miracles to show up and prove he exists? So go ahead and do that right now. All right, and once you've done that, I'm going to share some of my thoughts on that. I want you to think about what it would be like if God actually did that. Let's say God came into your bedroom at night and said, hey, guess what? I'm God. Here's your magic unicorn who gives you Skittles. Now you know that I exist, so believe in me, follow the commandments, treat one another with justice, and I'll see you in heaven, okay? Peace. Would that make you change your life around? Maybe for a little bit, but probably wouldn't work on all of us. Why wouldn't that, would that really convince us to change our lives? I want to share a story with you from the Bible. Okay, this is from Mark chapter 3, the Gospel of Mark chapter 3. So Jesus enters a synagogue, which is a Jewish temple, and there's a man there who had a withered hand, a crippled hand. And the Pharisees, who were Jewish preachers at the time, watched Jesus closely to see if he would cure him on the Sabbath day, so they might accuse him. The Sabbath day was a day when Jews were supposed to not do any sort of work. So if Jesus does this cure on the Sabbath day, then they can accuse him of breaking the Jewish laws and not being, a good man of God. He said to the man with the withered hand, Jesus said to him, come up here before us. Then he said to them, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath rather than to do evil, to save life rather than destroy it? But they remained silent, and looking around at them with anger and grieved at their hardness of heart, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. So Jesus cured the man's hand. The Pharisees went out and immediately took counsel with the king's guards against Jesus to put him to death. Okay, now you just saw Jesus do a miracle. And do they say, praise Jesus, hallelujah, he's the Messiah? No, they say, well, you did it on the Sabbath day, so we're going to go try to put you to death. They saw Jesus do a miracle, and still it didn't make them believe. And I think that would often be true for the rest of us, is that miracles wouldn't necessarily give someone faith. It wouldn't necessarily make them change their lives around. And lots of people who see miracles, they find later in life that they start to doubt them. They think, was that really real? Did that person really get healed? Did Jesus really show up in my bedroom with a magic Skittle-farting unicorn? Did that really happen? It has to take more than just this tremendous show of power for us to be really convinced. I want you to take a moment and answer these 3 questions on this passage, and then we'll move on. So take a moment, pause, and do that, and then we'll get into the last part of the video. All right, once you've done that, so these are kind of my reflections on why God doesn't just use miracles to prove he exists, is that miracles can't really convince us if we're not already open to God. If you notice in the passage, it said that the Pharisees had hard hearts, and Jesus was very sad about this. He was sad that they had hard hearts because he knew they weren't going to be open to this miracle that he was doing right in front of them. Only having a relationship with God will really be convincing for us. Really opening our heart to God is really the only way to really know that he exists. And so that's one of the reasons why we don't just study in this class, but we're also going to pray. And throughout the year, we're going to go on retreat, and we're going to do all sorts of things to try to understand God at an intellectual level, but also try to understand God at a spiritual level. That's all for this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you got all of those reflection questions. Make sure you got all the notes, and make sure you wrote down some other things as well. God bless.